Somewhere in the highlands of what is now Ethiopia, between the 1st and 6th centuries of the Common Era, a civilization rose that few in the modern world remember. Yet in its time, the Kingdom of Aksum rivaled Rome, Persia, and China as one of the world's great powers. This was not a footnote in African history. It was a center of the ancient world itself. From the 1st century onward, Aksumite merchants sailed the Red Sea, their ships carrying goods to India, Arabia, and beyond. They minted their own coins, stamped with the faces of their kings and the symbols of their faith. They developed their own written language, Ge'ez, which still survives in Ethiopian churches today. They built monuments that would astound any visitor, towering stone stelae, some reaching heights of 100 feet, carved with intricate designs and raised to honor their dead. By the 4th century, Aksum had embraced Christianity, becoming one of the earliest Christian kingdoms on earth, a fact that shaped their identity for centuries to come. They held what many believed to be the Ark of the Covenant itself, a treasure of immeasurable spiritual significance. Yet by the 7th century, as Islamic expansion transformed the Arabian Peninsula and surrounding regions, Aksum found itself increasingly isolated. The trade routes that had enriched them closed. The connections that had made them cosmopolitan faded. A great civilization did not fall to invasion or war, but rather withdrew from the world, becoming a mystery lost to history itself. In the highlands of what is now Ethiopia, where the earth rises toward the sky in ancient folds of stone and soil, a civilization emerged from obscurity to reshape the known world. The Kingdom of Aksum, flourishing between the 1st and 6th centuries of the Common Era, would become one of only 4 great superpowers of its age, standing alongside Rome, Persia, and China as a force that merchants, scholars, and rulers could not ignore. Yet today, this empire has largely vanished from global memory, its achievements dimmed by time, its influence overshadowed by the rise of other powers. To understand Aksum is to recover a crucial chapter in human history, one that reveals how Africa stood at the crossroads of civilization, how trade transformed continents, and how a single kingdom could bridge 3 worlds. The story of Aksum begins not with conquest or dramatic proclamation, but with geography and commerce. In the 1st century of the Common Era, the Red Sea served as the vital artery connecting the Mediterranean world, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian Ocean. Those who controlled the ports along this corridor controlled the flow of goods, gold, and ideas. The Red Sea was not a barrier, but an invitation, a highway of water that connected distant peoples and made them neighbors. Along the western shore of this sea, in the rugged highlands of what would become known as the Aksumite Empire, a people had begun to understand the immense value of their position. The terrain itself shaped the destiny of Aksum. The highlands of northern Ethiopia, characterized by dramatic elevation changes, deep valleys, and fertile plateaus, created both challenges and advantages. The climate during Aksum's formative centuries was generally favorable for agriculture, with reliable rainfall that supported the cultivation of grain and other crops essential to sustaining a growing population. This agricultural foundation would prove crucial, for it allowed the kingdom to support not only farmers and craftspeople, but also merchants, soldiers, and administrators. The land could feed the apparatus of empire. The Aksumite people did not arrive in these highlands as conquerors from distant lands. Rather, they were already present, descendants of populations that had inhabited the region for centuries. What changed in the 1st century of the Common Era was not the presence of people, but rather their organization, their ambition, and their understanding of the larger world beyond their borders. Archaeological evidence, carefully excavated and analyzed by scholars including R. Schneider in the 1970s and Stuart Monroe Hay in the 1980s and 90s, reveals a society that gradually transformed from a collection of local communities into a coordinated kingdom with centralized authority. The rise of Aksum as a dominant trading power coincided with the expansion of maritime commerce across the Indian Ocean. The discovery of the monsoon winds, which allowed predictable seasonal voyages across vast stretches of open water, revolutionized trade. Ships could now sail from the ports of the Red Sea to India and back with relative regularity. Aksum, positioned at the gateway to this maritime world, became an essential intermediary. The kingdom controlled the northern reaches of the Red Sea, and more importantly, it controlled access to valuable goods from the African interior. Ivory, gold, frankincense, and myrrh flowed from the highlands toward the sea, where merchants from across the known world eagerly purchased them. In return, goods from India, Arabia, and the Mediterranean world made their way inland, enriching Aksumite elites and widening the horizons of its people. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, Aksum had established itself as a major player in this trading network. The kingdom minted its own coinage, a mark of sovereignty and economic power that few African polities could claim. In approximately 270 of the Common Era, King Endubis issued the first Aksumite gold and silver coins, making Aksum the first African state outside of Egypt to strike its own currency. This was not merely an economic act, it was a political statement. The appearance of Aksumite coins in archaeological sites across the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean demonstrates the reach of the kingdom's commerce and the confidence of its rulers. The coins themselves tell stories. They bear the names and images of Aksumite kings, and on their reverse sides, they often display symbols of power and authority. Some coins show the ruler in profile, in the style of Roman coins, suggesting the degree to which Aksumite elites were aware of and influenced by the artistic conventions of the Mediterranean world. Yet these were distinctly Aksumite creations, not mere imitations. The inscriptions on the coins, written in Ge'ez, the language of ancient Aksum, asserted the kingdom's independence and authority. Here was a civilization that understood how to communicate its power through the medium of currency, reaching merchants and traders across vast distances. The physical center of Aksumite power lay in the city of Aksum itself, located in what is now the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, at coordinates 14.1253 degrees north and 38.7183 degrees east. The city occupied a strategic position in the highlands, with access to trade routes that connected it to the Red Sea coast in the east and to the interior of Africa in the south and west. Archaeological remains reveal a city of considerable sophistication. Structures of stone indicate permanent settlement and organized urban planning. Evidence of workshops suggests specialized craftspeople producing goods for trade and domestic consumption. But the most striking features of Aksum are its monumental stelae, massive stone structures that tower above the surrounding landscape. These obelisks, some carved from single pieces of stone and standing more than 33 meters tall, are among the most impressive architectural achievements of the ancient world. They served multiple purposes. Some scholars believe they marked elite burial sites, monuments to the power and prestige of Aksumite rulers. Others suggest they served as territorial markers, visible from great distances, announcing to all who approached that this land belonged to a powerful kingdom. The largest stelae display intricate carved designs, including depictions of multi-story buildings and architectural features that may represent the palaces and administrative centers of the kingdom. The construction of these stelae reveals the resources and organizational capacity of Aksum. Quarrying a block of stone that might weigh hundreds of tons, transporting it across the landscape, and then carving it into an elaborate monument required the coordination of numerous workers, the mobilization of resources, and the presence of skilled craftspeople. These were not the works of a simple or disorganized society. They represented the ambitions and capabilities of a civilization that had achieved considerable sophistication. During the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, Aksum entered what many scholars consider its period of greatest power and influence. The kingdom's military strength grew, and its territorial reach expanded. In approximately 350 of the Common Era, Aksumite forces conquered Meroe, the ancient capital of the Kushite kingdom that lay to the northwest, in what is now Sudan. This military victory was significant not only for the territory it gained, but for what it represented. Aksum had demonstrated the capacity to project military power beyond its immediate highlands, to defeat an established regional power, and to extend its authority over new lands and peoples. The conquest of Meroe extended Aksumite influence into Nubia and further enhanced the kingdom's control over trade routes. Yet the most transformative change in Aksumite civilization during this period was not military or economic, but spiritual. In 330 of the Common Era, the Kingdom of Aksum adopted Christianity under King Ezana. This was not a private conversion, but a state decision with profound implications. Christianity, still a relatively young religion, was spreading through the Mediterranean world and gaining followers across the Middle East and beyond. For Aksum to embrace Christianity was to align itself with a growing religious movement, and, more pragmatically, with the Christian Byzantine Empire that had become the dominant Mediterranean power after the decline of Rome's western reaches. The adoption of Christianity by Aksum was likely motivated by multiple factors. Trade connections with Christian merchants from the Mediterranean and the Middle East certainly played a role. Christian communities already existed within Aksumite territories, and the religion had already begun to gain adherents among the population. The decision to make Christianity the official religion of the kingdom was both a recognition of existing trends and a strategic alignment with powerful Christian neighbors. By embracing Christianity, Aksum positioned itself within a broader Christian commonwealth that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. This religious transformation had lasting consequences. It influenced the artistic and intellectual life of the kingdom. It shaped the values and worldview of Aksumite rulers and elites. It created connections between Aksum and Christian communities across the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The adoption of Christianity would eventually become central to Aksumite identity, so much so that the kingdom would be remembered in later centuries as a Christian civilization in a region that would become predominantly Muslim. The evidence for Aksum's power during this period comes from multiple sources. Ancient coins bearing the names of Aksumite rulers have been discovered in archaeological sites across the Indian Ocean, from India to the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. These coins attest to the far-reaching commerce of the kingdom. Inscriptions carved into stone monuments provide information about Aksumite rulers, their military campaigns, and their religious beliefs. These inscriptions, written in Ge'ez and sometimes in Greek, demonstrate the multilingual sophistication of Aksumite culture. The very fact that Aksumite rulers commissioned inscriptions in Greek, the language of the Mediterranean educated elite, shows how thoroughly integrated Aksum had become into the broader world of the classical age. The Aksumite Empire of the 4th and 5th centuries was a synthesis of multiple cultural influences, Its rulers and merchants engaged with the Mediterranean world through trade and diplomacy. They drew on cultural traditions from Arabia and the Red Sea region. They absorbed influences from the Indian Ocean world. Yet from this synthesis, they created something distinctly Aksumite, a civilization that was not a mere copy of Rome or Persia or any other power, but a unique expression of human creativity and ambition. The population of Aksum was diverse. Merchants from across the known world lived in Aksumite ports and cities, conducting their business and establishing communities. Local populations, whose ancestors had inhabited the highlands for generations, formed the foundation of Aksumite society. Enslaved peoples, captured in warfare or purchased through trade networks, provided labor for construction, agriculture, and service. Skilled craftspeople, including stonemasons, metalworkers, and potters, produced the goods that made Aksum wealthy. Farmers tended the fields that fed the kingdom. Soldiers served the king, defending his realm and expanding his power. The urban centers of Aksum, particularly the city of Aksum itself, served as hubs of this diverse society. Markets bustled with activity as merchants bought and sold goods from across the known world. Workshops produced crafted items for local consumption and for export. Administrative buildings housed the officials who oversaw the collection of taxes, the organization of trade, and the maintenance of order. Religious structures, including churches built after the adoption of Christianity, served the spiritual needs of the population and demonstrated the kingdom's commitment to its new faith. Beyond the cities, the Aksumite countryside supported an agricultural population. Farmers worked the fertile plateaus and valleys, growing grain and other crops. Herders managed livestock in the grasslands. Villages and smaller settlements dotted the landscape, connected to the centers of power through networks of trade and administration. This rural population provided the agricultural surplus that fed the cities and supported the merchants and craftspeople who made Aksum wealthy. The rise of Aksum during this period represents one of the great achievements of human civilization. Starting from a position of geographic advantage, the Aksumite people had created a kingdom that rivaled the great powers of the age. They had organized themselves into a centralized state with the capacity to mint currency, construct monumental architecture, maintain a military, and conduct sophisticated trade across vast distances. They had adopted a major world religion and integrated themselves into a broader Christian commonwealth. They had synthesized influences from multiple cultures into something new and distinctly their own. Yet even as Aksum reached its zenith of power in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, the forces that would eventually challenge and transform the kingdom were already in motion. The religious and political landscape of the Mediterranean and the Middle East was shifting. New powers were rising. The trade networks that had enriched Aksum were becoming increasingly contested. The very connections that had made Aksum powerful would eventually become sources of vulnerability. But in these centuries of glory, with its monumental stele rising above the highlands, its coins circulating across 3 continents, and its Christian faith binding it to the broader world, Aksum stood as a testament to what human ambition, intelligence, and organization could achieve. This was a civilization that would not be forgotten, though the world would forget it for many centuries to come. The transformation of Aksum from a regional kingdom into one of the ancient world's great powers unfolded gradually, across generations, woven into the very fabric of trade routes and human ambition. By the 1st century of the Common Era, the foundations laid in those earlier centuries of settlement and cultural development began to bear remarkable fruit. The merchants of Aksum had recognized something that would define their civilization. The highlands where they dwelled occupied a position of extraordinary geographical advantage, a crossroads where three worlds could meet. To the west lay the vast African continent with its interior riches. To the east, across the Red Sea, lay the Arabian Peninsula, and beyond it, the Persian Empire. And to the southeast, across the Indian Ocean, lay the distant subcontinent of India with its spices, textiles, and precious goods that the Mediterranean world hungered for with an almost insatiable appetite. Aksum stood at the fulcrum of these exchanges, and the people who inhabited these highland valleys possessed both the acumen to recognize this advantage and the determination to exploit it. The rise of Aksum as a trading power represents one of history's most elegant demonstrations of how geography, ambition, and cultural sophistication can converge to transform a people. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, Aksumite merchants had established themselves as essential intermediaries in the vast networks of commerce that connected the known world. They did not merely participate in trade, they became its architects, controlling the routes that funneled African ivory, frankincense, and myrrh northward and eastward, while receiving in return the manufactured goods and luxury items that fed the appetites of their own growing urban centers. The city of Aksum itself grew into a metropolis of considerable sophistication. Excavations conducted in the 1970s and 80s by scholars, including R. Schneider and Stuart Munro Hay, have revealed the architectural ambitions of a civilization at its peak. The city sprawled across the highland valleys, its buildings constructed with stone and carefully planned according to principles that reflected both practical necessity and aesthetic vision. Merchants' quarters clustered near the trading centers, where goods were assessed, weighed, and prepared for transport. Religious structures began to rise, reflecting the spiritual dimensions of this commercial society. Administrative buildings housed the officials who managed the intricate logistics of empire. Around 270 of the Common Era, King Anubis made a decision that would announce Aksum's arrival as a power of the first rank. He ordered the minting of coins, both in gold and in silver, stamped with his own image and inscriptions in Greek, the lingua franca of the Mediterranean world. This act carried profound symbolic weight. In the ancient world, only the greatest powers minted their own currency. Rome did so. Persia did so. The Hellenistic kingdoms that had succeeded Alexander's empire did so. By issuing coins, Anubis declared that Aksum would no longer be a client state or a peripheral player in international commerce. Aksum would be a sovereign power, worthy of recognition by the mightiest empires of the age. The coins themselves reveal much about Aksumite society during this period of flourishing. The gold coins, heavier and more valuable, bore the king's portrait in profile, following conventions established in the Hellenistic world. The inscriptions were executed in Greek, the language of educated elites across the Mediterranean. Yet these coins were not mere imitations of foreign models. They represented a synthesis, a statement that Aksum was part of the Mediterranean world while remaining distinctly itself. The imagery and inscriptions gradually incorporated local elements, Ge'ez script alongside Greek, symbols that reflected Aksumite religious beliefs and cultural values. The expansion of Aksumite power extended beyond commercial dominance. The kingdom's military strength grew commensurate with its wealth. Kings of the 3rd and 4th centuries commanded armies that could project power across impressive distances. Around 350 of the Common Era, Aksumite forces accomplished a feat of considerable military significance. They conquered Meroe, the ancient capital of the Kingdom of Kush, which had endured for centuries as a great power in its own right. This conquest extended Aksumite influence deep into Nubia, bringing vast territories and populations under Aksumite rule. The subjugation of Meroe demonstrated that Aksum had evolved from a trading state into a territorial empire capable of projecting military force and maintaining control over distant regions. The archaeological evidence from this period tells a story of unprecedented wealth and ambition. Excavations have uncovered numerous coins from this era, gold and silver pieces that attest to the volume of commerce flowing through Aksumite hands. Pottery from distant lands appears in the archaeological record, evidence of the far-reaching trade networks that connected Aksum to Egypt, Arabia, the Mediterranean, and India. The remains of warehouses and storage facilities suggest the scale of the commercial operations that sustained the kingdom's prosperity. Fragments of inscriptions in Greek and Ge'ez provide testimony to the multilingual character of Aksumite society, a civilization comfortable moving between languages as merchants moved between markets. Yet the most visible testament to Aksumite power and ambition would emerge during this period of flourishing, the great stele that would define the visual landscape of Aksum and astonish visitors for centuries to come. These monumental stone obelisks represented an architectural and engineering achievement of remarkable sophistication. The largest of these monuments, now known as the Obelisk of Aksum, rises to a height of more than 33 meters, a structure of such scale and precision that it commands attention even in its current state, broken and weathered by the passage of centuries. These stelae were not merely decorative. They served as markers of royal power, monuments to deceased kings, and demonstrations of the technical mastery and organizational capacity of Aksumite civilization. The construction of these stelae required not only artistic vision, but also logistical sophistication. Workers had to quarry enormous blocks of stone from the surrounding highlands, shape them with precision using bronze and iron tools, transport them across difficult terrain, and erect them using techniques that remain subjects of scholarly inquiry. The existence of such monuments speaks to a civilization capable of mobilizing substantial labor forces, of planning complex projects across extended periods, and of possessing the wealth necessary to undertake such ambitious works without immediate material return. The inscriptions carved into these stelae and into other stone monuments from this era provide invaluable windows into the worldview of the Aksumite elite. The inscriptions commemorate military victories, celebrate religious devotion, and proclaim the achievements of individual kings. They reveal a civilization proud of its accomplishments, confident in its position among the world's great powers, and increasingly concerned with the spiritual dimensions of kingship and governance. The religious transformation of Aksum represents one of the most significant developments in this period of rise and consolidation. The kingdom's traditional religions, which had emphasized veneration of the celestial bodies and a pantheon of local deities, gradually began to give way to a new faith that would ultimately transform the civilization's character entirely. Christianity, which had emerged in the Mediterranean world and was spreading through the Roman Empire during the 3rd and 4th centuries, began to penetrate into the highlands of Aksum through merchants and missionaries who traveled the trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. The conversion of King Ezana around 330 of the Common Era marked a watershed moment in Aksumite history. The evidence for this conversion comes from inscriptions attributed to Ezana that survive to the present day. Earlier inscriptions from his reign reference the traditional Aksumite deities, particularly the moon god. Later inscriptions invoke the Christian god, referring to divine blessing in explicitly Christian terms. This shift did not occur in isolation. It reflected broader changes occurring throughout the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, where Christianity was increasingly becoming the faith of empires and elites. It also reflected the reality that Christian merchants and communities had established themselves within Aksum's cosmopolitan trading centers, bringing with them their faith and their spiritual practices. The adoption of Christianity by the Aksumite crown represented far more than a mere change in religious observance. It signified a reorientation of the kingdom's identity and its place within the broader world. By embracing Christianity, Aksum aligned itself with a religious tradition that was becoming dominant throughout the Mediterranean world. It positioned itself within a global spiritual community that transcended political boundaries. The decision would have profound consequences for Aksumite culture, art, architecture, and literature. It would also, over the course of centuries, contribute to the kingdom's isolation from the Islamic world that would eventually dominate the regions surrounding it. The unique character of Aksumite Christianity deserves particular attention. The form of Christianity that took root in Aksum was not merely an import from the Mediterranean world. It synthesized with existing Aksumite traditions, local practices, and cultural values to create something distinctive. The Aksumite Church developed its own liturgical practices, its own theological emphases, and its own institutional structures. The integration of Christianity into Aksumite civilization demonstrates one of the kingdom's most characteristic features: its capacity for cultural synthesis, its ability to absorb external influences while maintaining a strong sense of its own identity. The 4th and 5th centuries witnessed the height of Aksumite power and prosperity. The kingdom controlled vast territories, commanded impressive military forces, and dominated the trade networks that connected Africa, Arabia, and Asia. Aksumite merchants ranged across the known world. The kingdom maintained diplomatic relations with Rome, with Persia, and with other great powers. Aksumite coins circulated in the markets of the Mediterranean, testimony to the volume of commerce flowing through the kingdom's hands. The city of Aksum itself had grown into a metropolis of considerable sophistication, with a population in the tens of thousands, bustling markets, temples and churches, administrative centers, and the residential quarters of merchants, craftspeople, and laborers. This period of prosperity generated the cultural achievements for which Aksum would be remembered. The monumental stelae reached their greatest heights during this era. The patronage of the arts flourished. Literature and scholarship developed within the context of the Christian church and the court. Coins and inscriptions from this period display increasing sophistication in their design and execution. The archaeological record reveals growing evidence of cultural contact with distant lands, with goods, ideas, and technologies flowing into Aksum from across the known world. The legend of the Ark of the Covenant, though it remains a matter of scholarly debate and not universally accepted, became associated with Aksum during this period of Christian flourishing. According to traditions preserved in Ethiopian Christian texts, the Ark, the most sacred object in Jewish religious tradition, was brought to Aksum, where it has been venerated ever since. Scholars continue to debate the historical basis for this claim, with some pointing to traditions of Jewish communities in the region and others viewing the claim as a later invention designed to enhance Aksum's spiritual prestige. What remains clear is that by the 5th century, Aksum had become not merely a great commercial and military power, but also a significant center of Christian learning and devotion. The cultural synthesis that characterized Aksumite civilization during its period of rise represents one of the most fascinating aspects of its history. The kingdom absorbed influences from the Mediterranean world, from Persia, from Arabia, and from India, yet maintained a distinctive character that was unmistakably Aksumite. The Ge'ez language, which had emerged as the primary language of the kingdom, became increasingly important as a vehicle for literature and learning, particularly in the context of the Christian Church. The architectural styles that developed in Aksum blended local traditions with influences from distant lands. The artistic traditions that flourished drew on multiple sources while creating something original. The environmental context during this period of flourishing deserves consideration. The climate of the Aksumite highlands during the 4th and 5th centuries was generally favorable for agriculture. Rainfall patterns supported the cultivation of grain and other crops that fed the kingdom's growing population. The highlands themselves provided natural resources, including stone for construction and various minerals. The geography that had made Aksum a crossroads for trade also provided natural defenses, with the rugged terrain offering protection against invasion from neighboring regions. As the 5th century progressed, the signs of Aksum's power were visible everywhere. The great stelae rose from the earth like monuments to human ambition. The city bustled with commerce and cultural activity. The kingdom's rulers commanded respect from distant powers. The Christian faith had been embraced by the elite and was spreading among the broader population. The merchant networks that Aksum had established connected the kingdom to markets across the known world. The coins minted in Aksumite mints circulated in distant lands, testimony to the kingdom's economic reach and influence. Yet even as Aksum reached the apex of its power and influence, the forces that would eventually lead to its decline were already in motion. The rise of new powers in the Arabian Peninsula, the gradual shift in trade patterns, the emergence of religions and political systems that would eventually challenge Aksumite supremacy, and the environmental challenges that would test the kingdom's resilience, all lay in the future. For now, in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, Aksum stood as one of the world's great civilizations, a kingdom that had risen from obscure origins to command the respect of empires and the admiration of distant peoples. The stelae rose into the highland sky, monuments to achievement, testimony to the heights that human civilization could reach through ambition, intelligence, and the fortunate accident of geographical position. The zenith of Aksumite power arrived quietly, without fanfare or proclamation. It came not in a moment of triumph, but in the accumulated weight of centuries, in the established trade routes that brought spices and silks from distant lands, in the coins bearing royal portraits that circulated through markets from the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, in the stones that rose ever higher toward the heavens. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the Kingdom of Aksum had achieved what few civilizations in human history have managed, a position of genuine equality among the world's greatest powers. Rome looked across the Mediterranean with respect. Persia recognized Aksum as a peer. The distant dynasties of China knew of this African kingdom's reach. Yet it was precisely at this moment of greatest splendor that the seeds of transformation were being sown, forces that would gradually redirect the currents of history and leave Aksum isolated on the edge of a transforming world. The reign of King Ezana marked a threshold moment, a spiritual and political turning point that would resonate through the centuries to follow. Around the year 330, Ezana made a decision that would fundamentally alter the character of Aksumite civilization. He embraced Christianity, not as a marginal sect, but as the official faith of the kingdom. The conversion was not unprecedented in the ancient world, but for Aksum, it represented something far more profound than a change in religious practice. It was a choice to align the kingdom with a rising force in the Mediterranean world, to position Aksum within a growing network of Christian states and communities that stretched from Egypt to Rome to the lands beyond. The historical record, preserved in inscriptions and later chronicles, reveals that Ezana's conversion was neither spontaneous nor isolated. Two Syrian Christian merchants, Frumentius and Aedesius, had arrived in Aksum as shipwrecked sailors. Rather than being cast aside as foreigners, they were welcomed into the royal court. Frumentius, in particular, gained the confidence of the king and the respect of the kingdom. He established churches, taught the faith to those who wished to learn, and became a bridge between the Christian communities of the Mediterranean and the ancient traditions of Aksum. When Frumentius was later consecrated as a bishop by the Patriarch of Alexandria, the connection between Aksum and the broader Christian world became formal and institutional. Yet Ezana's adoption of Christianity was not a rejection of Aksumite identity. Rather, it was a synthesis, a demonstration of the kingdom's remarkable capacity to integrate foreign influences while maintaining its distinctive character. The coins that Ezana minted bore the cross alongside traditional Aksumite symbols. The written records of his reign, inscribed in Greek and Ge'ez, proclaimed his Christian faith while also celebrating his military victories and his role as protector of trade and prosperity. The conversion represented not a rupture, but an evolution, a way of connecting the ancient kingdom to the larger currents of the Mediterranean world while remaining rooted in the highlands of Ethiopia. The architectural achievements of this period reveal the confidence and ambition of Aksumite rulers during these centuries of peak power. The monumental stelae that rose from the earth in the city of Aksum itself became ever more elaborate and impressive. These were not merely decorative monuments, but profound expressions of political authority, religious devotion, and cultural achievement. The largest of these stelae, known to later generations as the Obelisk of Aksum, reached skyward to a height of more than 33 meters. Carved from single blocks of stone, these monuments required not only tremendous technical skill, but also access to vast resources and the ability to mobilize large numbers of workers. They stood as physical embodiments of Aksumite power, visible for miles across the highlands, reminders to all who saw them of the kingdom's reach and accomplishment. The construction of these stelae reflects a society at the height of its confidence and capability. The stoneworkers and architects who designed them possessed sophisticated knowledge of engineering and aesthetics. The rulers who commissioned them possessed the wealth and authority necessary to undertake such monumental projects. The religious and cultural significance of these monuments, whether understood as tributes to the divine, markers of royal tombs, or expressions of cosmic order, reveals the intellectual and spiritual sophistication of Aksumite civilization. These were not the works of a marginal kingdom, but of a civilization that saw itself as central to the world's order. Yet even as these monuments were being raised, the geopolitical landscape beyond the highlands of Ethiopia was shifting in ways that would gradually reshape the world in which Aksum existed. The rise of Islam in the 7th century represented not merely a new religion, but a new political and economic force that would reorganize the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean worlds. The rapid expansion of Islamic empires across North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually into Iberia created a new configuration of power and trade. The ancient trade routes that had enriched Aksum began to shift. The Red Sea, once a highway connecting Aksum to the wider world, became increasingly controlled by Islamic powers. The Indian Ocean trade, which had brought such prosperity to Aksumite merchants, began to be redirected through new centers of power and new trading networks. The historical record, analyzed by scholars across generations, reveals that Aksum did not experience a sudden collapse, but rather a gradual isolation. The kingdom continued to exist, to mint coins, to maintain its Christian faith, and to exercise authority over its territories. Yet the flow of wealth that had sustained the empire's power began to diminish. The merchant ships that had brought spices and silks and precious goods became fewer. The gold and silver that had flowed into Aksumite treasuries slowed to a trickle. The cosmopolitan character that had defined the kingdom, its openness to foreign traders, its participation in the networks that connected Africa, Arabia, and India, began to contract. Archaeological evidence from this period tells a story of gradual transformation. The coins that had been minted with such regularity during the prosperous centuries became less frequent. The monumental construction projects that had characterized earlier periods slowed and eventually ceased. The urban centers that had flourished as trading hubs experienced decline. Trade goods from distant lands became rarer in Aksumite archaeological contexts. The material culture of the kingdom, which had reflected its position as a cosmopolitan power connected to the wider world, became more localized and less diverse. Yet this period of decline was not one of cultural collapse or civilizational failure. The Aksumite kingdom maintained its Christian faith with remarkable consistency. The written traditions, recorded in Ge'ez, preserved the memory and the teachings of the kingdom's religious and cultural heritage. The agricultural communities that formed the foundation of Aksumite civilization continued to work the highlands to produce the grain and other resources that sustained the population. The sense of identity and continuity that had been forged across centuries persisted even as the external conditions that had enabled Aksum's rise began to change. The legend of the Ark of the Covenant became increasingly associated with Aksum during this period of transition. Whether the Ark actually came to rest in the highlands of Ethiopia remains a subject of scholarly debate, with evidence and traditions pointing in various directions and interpretations differing among historians and religious communities. Yet the association between Aksum and this most sacred object of the Jewish and Christian traditions reveals something profound about how the kingdom understood itself. Even as its political and economic power waned, Aksum claimed a spiritual significance that transcended material wealth or military might. To possess or to protect the Ark was to possess a form of power that could not be measured in coins or trade goods, a spiritual authority that connected Aksum to the deepest currents of religious tradition. The reign of Caleb, who ruled in the early 6th century, represented a final flourish of Aksumite military power before the long decline accelerated. Caleb led Aksumite forces across the Red Sea to conquer territories in Arabia, establishing Aksumite dominance over regions that had previously been beyond the kingdom's direct control. These military campaigns demonstrated that Aksum retained the capacity to project power beyond its traditional highlands territories. Yet these campaigns also represented a kind of last gasp, an attempt to maintain through military force the dominance that had previously been sustained through trade and economic integration. The conquest of Meroe, the ancient capital of Kushite power in what is now Sudan, represented perhaps the final great triumph of Aksumite military achievement. Around the year 350, Aksumite forces moved against the weakened Kushite kingdom and brought it under Aksumite control. This conquest extended Aksumite territorial dominion into Nubia and represented a moment when the kingdom seemed to be expanding rather than contracting. Yet the conquest of Meroe proved to be a Pyrrhic victory, a triumph that consumed resources without generating the economic benefits that had sustained earlier Aksumite expansion. The Kushite territories, once conquered, proved difficult to govern and less economically valuable than the trade networks that had previously enriched the kingdom. The environmental context of this period, as revealed through archaeological and paleoclimatic research, suggests that the highlands of Ethiopia experienced climatic shifts that affected agricultural productivity. The favorable rainfall patterns that had supported grain production during earlier centuries appear to have become less reliable. Droughts and periods of agricultural stress would have reduced the surplus that enabled Aksum to support its urban centers and trading establishments. While scholars debate the extent to which environmental factors directly caused Aksumite decline, the evidence suggests that climatic stress combined with the geopolitical shifts caused by Islamic expansion to create a perfect storm of challenges that gradually overwhelmed the kingdom's capacity to maintain its position. The transformation of the Mediterranean world during this period further isolated Aksum from the networks that had sustained its prosperity. As Islamic powers came to dominate North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, the Christian kingdoms of Europe and the Middle East found themselves increasingly separated from one another. The cosmopolitan trading networks that had connected merchants of different faiths and backgrounds began to fragment. The sea lanes that had been relatively safe for merchants of all religions became more dangerous and more controlled by specific political powers. Aksum, positioned as it was on the edge of this transforming world, found itself cut off from the networks that had previously connected it to Rome, to the Mediterranean, and to the wider world beyond. The gradual shift toward isolation was not experienced as a dramatic rupture, but as a slow constriction of possibilities. Aksumite merchants found fewer opportunities to trade in distant markets. Foreign merchants became less frequent visitors to Aksumite ports and cities. The flow of information, of ideas, of goods that had characterized the cosmopolitan period began to slow. The kingdom that had once been as cosmopolitan as Rome or Ctesiphon began to turn inward, to focus on maintaining its own territories and traditions rather than projecting power and influence outward. Yet even in this period of contraction, Aksum maintained elements of its former grandeur. The kingdom continued to issue coins, though with decreasing frequency and in smaller quantities. The Christian faith, now deeply rooted in Aksumite culture and identity, remained central to the kingdom's self-understanding. The traditions of learning, of record-keeping, of cultural continuity that had been established in earlier centuries persisted. The highlands of Ethiopia, which had given birth to Aksumite civilization, remained productive and capable of sustaining a significant population. The turning point represented by this period was not a moment of sudden transformation, but a gradual reorientation of the world in which Aksum existed. The kingdom had risen to prominence through its integration into far-flung networks of trade and cultural exchange. It had achieved its greatest power and influence through its ability to connect Africa, Arabia, and India, to serve as a bridge between worlds. Yet the forces that had enabled this integration, the openness of trade routes, the relative stability of the Mediterranean world, the absence of dominant powers capable of controlling the sea lanes, began to shift. As new powers rose and new configurations of political authority emerged, Aksum found itself increasingly isolated, cut off from the networks that had sustained its prosperity and power. This was the crisis of Aksum, not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual marginalization. The kingdom did not disappear, did not cease to exist or to exercise authority. Yet it was transformed from a great power, equal to Rome and Persia, into a regional kingdom, significant in its own territories, but no longer connected to the wider world in the ways that had once defined its character. The stelae that had been raised during the earlier centuries continued to stand, monuments to a glory that was gradually receding into the past. The coins that had circulated through distant markets became increasingly rare. The merchants and traders who had once brought the goods of the world to Aksumite markets became fewer and fewer. Yet this transformation, as profound as it was, did not erase the achievements of Aksumite civilization. The adoption of Christianity had created a spiritual legacy that would persist through the centuries. The monumental architecture, the coins, the inscriptions, the written records, all of these would survive as testimony to Aksumite greatness. The highlands of Ethiopia would continue to be inhabited, to maintain cultural traditions, to preserve memories of the ancient kingdom. Though Aksum itself would gradually fade from the consciousness of the wider world, its influence and its legacy would persist in ways that future generations could scarcely imagine, encoded in the stones of the stelae, in the words of the chronicles, in the faith of the people who inhabited the lands where the great kingdom had once flourished. The 7th century arrived upon the highlands of Aksum like a shifting wind, not violent, but persistent and irreversible. The great kingdom that had rivaled Rome, Persia, and China in its golden centuries now faced a transformation as profound as any it had experienced in its 1,000-year ascent. The forces reshaping the world were not armies marching through mountain passes, though warfare would come. Rather, they were tectonic shifts in trade, religion, and geopolitics that would gradually isolate the Christian kingdom from the wider networks that had sustained its prosperity. The rise of Islamic power in Arabia and the Mediterranean fundamentally altered the commercial arteries through which Aksum had pumped its wealth. The Red Sea, once a highway of Aksumite commerce where their merchants moved freely between Africa, Arabia, and India, became increasingly contested. Where Aksumite traders had once negotiated openly with Arab partners, they now found themselves marginalized, their influence diminished by the rapid expansion of Islamic polities. The trade routes that had enriched Aksum for centuries, the pathways bringing Indian spices, Arabian incense, and Mediterranean luxury goods to their ports, began to flow around them rather than through them. By the 7th century, the scholars debate the precise mechanisms of this decline. Some evidence suggests that environmental factors played a crucial role alongside political disruption. The favorable climate that had supported robust grain production and sustained the agricultural base of Aksumite civilization appears to have become less reliable. Rainfall patterns shifted, and the highlands that had nourished the kingdom's population began to demand more precarious calculations of survival. Drought cycles that might have been manageable centuries earlier, when Aksum commanded vast trading networks and resources, became increasingly catastrophic when those external supports eroded. Yet within this period of contraction, the essential character of Aksumite civilization endured. The Christian faith that had been adopted under King Ezana around 330 CE had taken deep root in the Aksumite soul. It was no longer a royal decree or a diplomatic gesture. It had become woven into the very identity of the people. The monasteries that dotted the highlands served not merely as religious centers, but as repositories of learning, preserving manuscripts, maintaining agricultural innovations, and sustaining intellectual life even as the empire's political reach contracted. The Aksumite Church developed its own distinctive practices and theological traditions, creating a form of Christianity uniquely adapted to the African highlands. The monumental stelae that still stood across the Aksumite landscape in these centuries were themselves monuments to a fading glory. The largest of these great obelisks, known as the Obelisk of Aksum, rose over 33 meters into the sky, a breathtaking assertion of power and permanence that had been erected centuries earlier during Aksum's zenith. These stelae were not merely decorative, they marked burial sites of the great, inscribed with records of royal accomplishments and divine favor. They were statements in stone about the permanence of the kingdom and the cosmic order it represented. Yet as Aksum's power waned, the construction of these monuments ceased. No new stelae were raised to commemorate new triumphs. The great stones became remnants of a past grandeur rather than declarations of present strength. The legend of the Ark of the Covenant became increasingly central to Aksumite identity during these centuries of transformation. According to traditions preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the Ark had been brought to Aksum in ancient times, perhaps by Menelik I, the legendary son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Whether this tradition has historical foundation remains a topic of scholarly debate. The claims that the Ark is housed in Aksum are not universally accepted by historians and theologians. Yet the power of this legend cannot be dismissed. It provided Aksum with a spiritual anchor, a connection to the deepest wellsprings of Judeo-Christian tradition. In a kingdom increasingly isolated from the wider Christian world and surrounded by the rising tide of Islam, this claim to possession of Christianity's most sacred relic became a source of profound spiritual authority and cultural identity. The coins that Aksumite kings had minted with such pride, beginning in the time of King Endubis around 270 CE, the gold and silver pieces that had circulated throughout the known world, bearing the profiles of Aksumite monarchs and Christian symbols, gradually disappeared from circulation. The Aksumite mint fell silent. No longer did Aksum possess the economic reach or the trading connections that made coinage valuable beyond its borders. The very medium of international commerce shifted away from Aksumite control. The minting of currency had been one of the great markers of Aksumite sovereignty and participation in the world system. Its cessation was not merely an economic fact, but a symbolic withdrawal from the stage of world power. The city of Aksum itself underwent a transformation. In its peak centuries, from roughly the 3rd to the 6th century, it had been a metropolis of genuine significance. Archaeological excavations conducted by researchers, including R. Schneider in the 1970s and Stuart Munro Hay in the 1980s and 1990s, have revealed the sophisticated urban planning, the substantial architecture, and the cosmopolitan character of the ancient city. Pottery from across the known world has been found in Aksumite archaeological contexts, testifying to the breadth of commercial connections. Yet as the 7th century progressed and beyond, the city contracted. The grand structures fell into disrepair. The population that had once numbered in the tens of thousands dwindled. The great metropolis became a regional center, then a place of pilgrimage and religious significance rather than a seat of empire. The written records of Aksum's decline are sparse and fragmentary. Much of what we know comes from external sources: Arab geographers, Byzantine chroniclers, and Indian merchants who noted the changing fortunes of the Red Sea trade. The Aksumites themselves left fewer inscriptions during these centuries of contraction. Yet what records do survive paint a picture of a civilization adapting to new realities while maintaining its essential character. Kings continued to rule from Aksum, though their authority and reach diminished. The Church continued to minister to the faithful, maintaining theological learning and spiritual practice. The Highland people continued their agricultural life, their pastoral traditions, their cultural practices. The relationship between Aksum and the rising Islamic powers was complex and varied. It was not uniformly hostile. Trade continued, albeit in diminished form. Diplomatic relations persisted, yet the fundamental structure of the world had shifted. Islam's rapid expansion across North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and into the Mediterranean meant that Aksum was increasingly surrounded by Islamic polities. The Mediterranean, which had been a Christian sea where Aksumite merchants had moved with relative ease, became increasingly dominated by Islamic naval powers. The Indian Ocean, while remaining more cosmopolitan and commercially diverse, saw Aksumite participation decline as Arab and Persian merchants expanded their networks. The Zagwe dynasty eventually succeeded the Aksumite Empire, a transition traditionally dated to around 1137 CE. This succession represented both continuity and change. The Zagwe rulers maintained Christianity and claimed connection to Aksumite traditions. They constructed their own monumental churches, most notably the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, which became a new center of pilgrimage and spiritual authority. Yet the Zagwe were not Aksumites, and their rise marked the formal end of Aksumite political dominance. The kingdom that had once sent armies to conquer Kushite Meroe around 350 CE, that had minted its own coins, that had negotiated as an equal with Rome and Persia, had passed from the stage of world history. Yet to speak of Aksum's decline is not to speak of its disappearance. The Aksumite legacy persisted in multiple forms. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which traces its origins directly to the Aksumite Christian tradition established under King Ezana, continued as a living institution. The language of Ge'ez, the Aksumite liturgical language, remained in use in the Ethiopian Church for centuries, becoming the vehicle through which Christian theology and practice were transmitted. The cultural practices, the artistic traditions, the architectural styles that had emerged in Aksum continued to influence the Highland civilization that succeeded it. The great stelae remained standing, silent witnesses to past glory. The largest among them, the obelisk of Aksum, became a symbol of Aksumite achievement that would endure into the modern era. Though it would eventually be removed and placed in Rome as a trophy, then later restored to Aksum. The very existence of these monuments ensured that Aksum's memory would not be entirely erased. Archaeologists and historians would eventually return to these sites, would excavate the remains of the ancient city, would piece together from pottery shards and inscriptions and architectural remains the story of this lost kingdom. The legend of the Ark of the Covenant maintained its power in Ethiopian consciousness and in the wider Christian imagination. Whether the Ark truly rests in the Church of St. Mary of Zion in Aksum remains debated among scholars and believers alike. The claims have never been definitively verified or refuted. Yet the legend itself became a form of cultural memory, a way in which the Aksumites and their descendants maintained a connection to the deepest currents of their spiritual tradition. The Ark, in legend, if not in verified historical fact, represented the idea that Aksum had possessed something precious, something sacred, something that connected them to the very foundations of Christian faith. The isolation of Aksum after the rise of Islamic powers in the 7th century and beyond was not total, but it was profound. Where Aksum had once been a bridge between Africa, Arabia, and India, it became increasingly peripheral to the great commercial and cultural networks that shaped the medieval world. The Indian Ocean trade that had enriched Aksum continued to flourish, but without Aksumite participation. The Mediterranean commerce that had once flowed through Aksumite ports now bypassed them. The knowledge networks that had connected Aksum to Byzantine learning and Indian scholarship became increasingly attenuated. Yet this very isolation had an unexpected consequence. It allowed the Aksumite tradition to develop in distinctive ways, uninfluenced by later theological and cultural currents that transformed Christianity in Europe and the Mediterranean. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved practices and liturgical forms that had roots in the earliest centuries of Christianity. The Ge'ez language and the theological literature written in it maintained forms of expression that connected to Aksumite times. In this sense, isolation became a form of preservation. What had been lost in a political power and commercial reach was compensated for, in some measure, by the maintenance of a distinctive cultural and spiritual identity. The highlands of what is now Ethiopia, where Aksum had risen, continued to sustain human civilization. The agricultural practices developed during Aksumite times persisted. the cultural traditions maintained their vitality. The Christian faith that had been adopted in the 4th century remained the dominant religion of the region. The memory of Aksum, though fading, was never entirely lost. It lived on in stories, in traditions, in the monuments that still stood on the landscape. It lived on in the consciousness of the Highland people as a memory of former greatness, a reminder that their region had once stood among the great powers of the world. The decline of Aksum, then, was not a catastrophic collapse, but a gradual contraction, a shift from centrality to periphery, from dominance to accommodation. The kingdom that had flourished from roughly the 1st century through the 6th century CE, reaching its peak around the 4th and 5th centuries, did not vanish in a moment. Rather, it faded, like a great fire gradually consuming its fuel, until what remained was embers glowing in the darkness, still warm, still capable of illuminating the surrounding night, but no longer blazing with the intensity that had once lit the ancient world. The legacy of Aksum endured precisely because it had been so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of African, Christian, and world history. The trading networks that Aksum had pioneered became templates for later commercial systems. The synthesis of African, Arabian, and Mediterranean influences that Aksum had achieved became a model for cultural interaction. The adoption of Christianity in Africa that Aksum had pioneered established a tradition that would eventually spread across the continent. The monumental architecture, the artistic achievements, the administrative practices, the intellectual traditions that had flourished in Aksum became part of the inheritance of the regions that succeeded it. In the 21st century, the ruins of Aksum still stand in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia. The great stelae still rise above the landscape, their presence commanding attention and respect. Ongoing excavations continue to uncover new artifacts and new insights into Aksumite civilization. The Church of St. Mary of Zion still stands in Aksum, one of the most sacred sites in Ethiopian Christianity, drawing pilgrims who come to pray in the traditions maintained since Aksumite times. The legend of the Ark of the Covenant continues to capture imaginations and inspire scholarly investigation. The story of Aksum, then, is not merely a story of rise and fall, of empire and decline. It is a story of cultural synthesis and spiritual achievement. It is a story of how a civilization that arose in the highlands of Africa participated fully in the world system of its time, engaging with Rome, Persia, India, and Arabia as an equal partner. It is a story of how a kingdom adopted a faith and made that faith central to its identity, creating a distinctively African Christianity. It is a story of how great monuments were constructed, how cities were built, how commerce was conducted, how knowledge was preserved and transmitted. And it is a story of how, when the circumstances that had sustained that civilization changed, the people adapted, persisted, and maintained their cultural identity through centuries of transformation. The Aksumite Empire disappeared from the stage of world power, but the Aksumite legacy endured. In the stones of its monuments, in the traditions of its church, in the memory of its achievements, in the continuing civilization of the Ethiopian highlands, Aksum lived on. The lost Christian kingdom of Africa was not truly lost. It was transformed, incorporated into later traditions, woven into the larger tapestry of African and world history. And in that transformation and incorporation, it achieved a form of immortality, a continuation of influence and presence that transcended the political boundaries of any single kingdom or the span of any single era. The story of Aksum reminds us that great civilizations do not merely disappear. They change form, shift their expression, but continue to shape the world long after their moment of dominance has passed into history.